finally, part 4 of the meanest events in history. I feel like I should have clarified some things at the start of the series. The only atrocities included in this are man-made. Natural disasters, famines, and diseases don't count unless they happened or at least were amplified a lot by people. So things like the Black Death don't count. Catharism was a persistent heresy that survived several centuries of attempted eradication all across Europe. Cathars believed that Jesus was not of this corrupt world, but was purely a divine entity. He had come to replace the vicious, vengeful God of the Old Testament who had created our flawed universe. Cathars believed that all people should strive to separate themselves from the corruption of the material world, since it was inherently evil. After many centuries, the Cathars were finally exterminated in their last stronghold in the south of France in the 13th century. Sovereignty was complicated in the Languedoc region of southern France. Although the French king had ultimate dominion over the region, outsiders like the kings of England and Spain had some valuable fiefdoms scattered around the area as well. Feudal lords had even more autonomy here than most of their peers elsewhere. The lack of central authority attracted heretics. The Cathars, who here we will call Albigensians, weren't the majority in Languedoc, but they were a tolerated minority. But the problem was that the French king and the Catholic Church didn't believe the Cathars showed enough respect for their authority. Local lords, such as the powerful Count Raymond VI of Toulouse and other rulers, protected the Cathar leaders, both of them having clear interest to stay independent from the king. This was bothersome to France and the Catholic Church. Pope Innocent III urged King Philip II of France to have Raymond deal with the heresy, or he will be deposed of as ruler. Raymond did not embrace Cathar beliefs, but was sympathetic, and also hated the French king. I mean, of course, any normal person wants to sock any French person I see. In May of 1207, Raymond was excommunicated by the church for being uncooperative. In January of 1208, Rome sent a delegation of preachers and monks under Pierre de Castelnau and had some success in converting people to Catholicism. But for the most part, they were hated, and Pierre left due to fear of being assassinated. Raymond met Pierre in hope of reversing his excommunication. The discussion went badly, and the following morning, Pierre was killed, probably by one of Raymond's knights. Pope Innocent was infuriated and released all of Raymond's subjects from their oaths of obedience to him. However, Raymond reconciled with the church and eventually his excommunication was lifted. But again, Raymond was excommunicated for not fulfilling the condition of the ecclesiastical reconciliation. With Raymond being excommunicated twice and Pierre assassinated, Pope Innocent now demanded bishops in southern France to interdict, which means prohibit from participating in certain holy rites like the sacraments, to every participant in the murder, including the towns that sheltered them. Innocent then demanded King Philip II to raise an army to suppress the Albigensians. The army was led by Simon de Montfort, and the crusade turned into a war of conquest rather than a harsh reform, much to the disapproval of Pope Innocent. Town after town fell to the Crusaders. After the water supply to Carcassonne was cut, the inhabitants surrendered and were exiled with just the clothes they wore on their back. The mountain fortress of Minerve near Béziers lost its water supply when the Crusaders' catapults destroyed the fortified tunnel to the town's well. After Minerve surrendered, the Cathars were forcibly converted to Catholicism, except for the 140 who refused to convert, and were burned at the stake. After the capture of Bram, every member of the Cathar garrison had his eyes gouged out and his nose and upper lip sliced off. Only one soldier was left with a single eye intact in order to guide the faithless men back to spread fear in Cathar territory. Raymond had been keeping a low profile, riding along in support of the crusade, but after a year of watching his domain become ravaged, he switched sides. After Toulouse withstood a siege by Simon de Montfort, Raymond counterattacked, retaking much of the lost territory and bringing Montfort under siege. The next year, the Catholics had the upper hand and ended up outside Toulouse again. Because Raymond was the vassal and brother-in-law of King Peter II of Aragon in northern Spain, this king now joined the fight against the Crusaders. Languedoc became a maelstrom of battle, and Toulouse changed hands several times before it was all done. But the war dragged on, year after year, without a final knockout blow. The war lasted longer than its major participants. King Peter II of Spain was killed in battle at Muret in 1213. In 1218, Simon de Montfort was killed outside Toulouse by a stone from a catapult, operated by women of the town. Raymond fled to England for a time, then went to Rome to plead his case. He returned to fight and finally died in 1222. During the 1220s, the war continued under a new generation of leaders, sons of Simon and Raymond. But one by one, the last Cathar strongholds fell and stayed down. In 1226, King Louis VIII of France pledged himself to the crusade, and now the full French army overwhelmed the heretics in one tough year of campaigning. The king then negotiated acceptable terms with the most powerful nobles of the south, and the Treaty of Paris ended hostilities in 1229. Sporadic rebellions and uprisings continued for several decades. The remaining Cathars were burned, the last of them in 1321. After a few centuries of division, China was reunited under the Sui dynasty. But the northern Korean kingdom of Goguryeo decided to raid across the border one last time before the new rulers got organized. The Chinese emperor responsible for the reunification, Wendy, or by his birth name, Yang Jiang, was furious and retaliated in 598 AD with a massive invasion designed to conquer Korea all the way down to the tip. He sent an army of 300,000 across the Liao River and down the Korean peninsula toward the capital of Pyongyang. The invasion went very badly. The Chinese apparently forgot that July and August are the rainy season in Manchuria. The roads were muddy, and the fleet that accompanied the army was battered by storms. Whenever the Chinese ships docked, Goguryeo troops attacked them, until finally, the Goguryeo Navy sailed out and smashed the Chinese armada. Meanwhile, Korean guerrillas harassed the Chinese army all the way in, and then all the way out, and the Chinese lost most of their men. It took a while for China to recover from the disaster, but Wendy's son, Yang Di, his successor and probable assassin, tried again in 612. He recruited 1 million soldiers, and many times that number of support personnel. He repaired and expanded the Grand Canal that connected the Yellow and Yangtze rivers in order to bring men and supplies from south to north. He established massive stockpiles and gathered coastal transportation to shadow the army as it moved overland. As long as his army stayed within an easy wagon ride of the coast, the Chinese Navy could keep the forces supplied. The Chinese crossed the Liao River again with 305,000 troops, but when progress slowed, the fleet zipped ahead and landed a large force of Marines to take Pyongyang Castle. After scattering the defenders, the Chinese Marines broke ranks to loot, which left them exposed to a Goguryeo ambush, in which the Marines were slaughtered and chased off. Only a couple thousand made it back to the safety of the fleet. The Chinese army, meanwhile, pushed onward. For a time, the Goguryeo and Sui commanders played mind games, trying to lure one another into negotiations in order to spring a trap or gather intelligence. Finally, the Goguryean commander, Yolji, closed this phase by sending a rude poem to his Sui counterpart, and the campaign resumed. After pushing south, the Chinese began crossing the Salzu River. The Goguryans, however, had secretly dammed the river above the crossing, and when the Sui army was halfway across the deceptively shallow river, the Goguryans released the flood. Thousands of Chinese drowned, and the rest fled. Of the 305,000 Chinese soldiers who had invaded Korea, only 2,700 returned. The repeated defeats in Korea fatally weakened the Sui dynasty. It didn't last much longer, and would shortly be replaced by the Tang dynasty. In 2011, much of Syria was unhappy with the Ba'athist government, which led to large protests across Syria as part of the wider Arab Spring movement. Many Westerners believed this would be the first stage in bringing democracy to the Middle East. Since then, however, it seems unlikely that a democracy will ever work in the Middle East. The protests were violently suppressed by the Syrian military. Tens of thousands of people died during the initial crackdowns ordered by President Bashar al-Assad. The Assad regime came to power through a coup d'etat in 1971. Ba'ath socialists expelled or killed the traditional Muslim Ba'athists in government, and Hafez al-Assad declared himself president. He wasn't very popular. In 1973, a new constitution was signed, which gave the Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party the position of being the leader of the state and society. The party was very enthusiastic to be given this authority, and got right to work. When the constitution was signed, it removed Islam as the state religion, and now the president of Syria no longer had to be Muslim. This did not go over well with the 90% Muslim population of Syria. They also started to institute more socialist economic policies and tried to encourage socialist revolutions in the Middle East, since they didn't want Arabic unity, because that would imply Muslim unity, since they also held the anti-religious view that is typical with Marxists. The Socialist Ba'ath Party was not afraid to use civilians to get government programs in motion, i.e. forced labor. They supervised all illegal trade unions and taught Ba'ath ideology in schools. Between 1976 and 1982, protests organized by the Muslim Brotherhood popped up all over Syria, but were violently suppressed, culminating with the Hama massacre, in which up to 40,000 people were killed by their own government. But this was just the beginning of anti-Assad regime resentment. The Assad regime has been consolidating its power ever since, using things like censorship, mass murders, torture, and having to pledge loyalty to Assad if you wanted to do anything significant in the country. After Hafez al-Assad's death in 2000, his son, Bashar al-Assad, took power. Bashar's reign started off pretty bad. He inherited a pissy-poopy economy from his father, and the 5-year-long drought that started in 2006 amplified Syrian instability. The country was just begging for a collapse. After the harsh crackdowns of the Arab Spring protests in early 2011, the country realized reform wouldn't work, so eventually a large amount of armed militia resistance started to pop up. They were poorly organized and couldn't coordinate, until on July 29th, when a group of defected officers established the first organized oppositional military force, the Free Syrian Army. Since then, like most modern civil wars, it has split between a dozen different factions, with hard to remember names. We have the Syrian Armed Forces, which represents the Assad regime. There's also the Syrian Interim Government, which is a mismatch between pro-democracy movements and nationalist opposition groups. Another faction called the Syrian Salvation Government, which is a group of Sunni militias in the territory of Rojava. Also, the Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria, with its military being backed by the pro-democracy countries, and several terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda, Haras al-Adin, and the Islamic State of Iraq and Levant, with new groups being taken in and out of the mix since the start of the war. And of course, outside countries like Iran, Russia, and the United States getting in on the fun. Least complicated modern civil war. Fun fact, every entity involved in the war has been accused of war crimes. Russia and Iran came in to back up Assad. The US and other Western militaries backing pro-democracy factions. And the United Nations writing 100-page long persuasive essays to let these guys know that fighting isn't actually cool guys with guns, and that fighting is for total meanie heads. In 2014, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant crossed into Iraq and took a good chunk of territory. Iraq was in a war itself after the Americans left a big power vacuum in 2011 when they left. But this spillover prompted Obama to send more troops to the Middle East. Most of the fighting has tapered off since 2017, with occasional flare-ups and mass protests. But by 2023, direct fighting against Assad has mostly disappeared, since they now control around 2/3 of the country. A far cry from 2015, where they were pushed back into controlling maybe 20% of Syria. Somewhere out in the middle of nowhere, a long time ago, the Chinese wiped out a tribe that only a few people know about. Most of history is like this. The Dzungars were a species of Mongol. The nomadic horsemen of the Central Asian steppe, such as the Huns and Mongols, had been a continuous threat to civilization. Horsemen such as the Manchus and Tartars were terrorizing China and Russia. See Russo-Tartar War, which is number 79 on the list. Now, guns had turned the tide against these nomads, and their independence was being squeezed by advancing civilization. Emperor Qianlong brought the Qing Empire to its widest extent by conquering all around the periphery of China, notably into the western desert and Xinjiang, which was the land of the Dzungars. Until he died in 1745, Galdan Sring, Khan of Dzungaria, had maintained tight control over all of the competent tribes in his empire. His son and successor, however, was cruel and a complete degenerate, so the Dzungbar nobility blinded and imprisoned him. His successor was a beta soy boy who let several tribes drift into independence before he was killed in a coup. While the new Khan, Dowaji, was consolidating control, several losers in the power struggle took refuge in Chinese territory and asked for help. Emperor Qianlong was happy to oblige. A Chinese army took the Dzungbar capital at Kulja and put Galdan Sering's fugitive son-in-law, Amarasana, in charge. After a chase across the desert, the former Khan, Dowaji, was captured by the Chinese, but they tucked him away in a comfortable retirement rather than killing him. Because the Chinese did not want a strong Dzungar state on their border, they recognized the autonomy of individual tribes, rather than restoring the unified Dzungar Empire. But Amarasana had been hoping to inherit his father-in-law's grand empire, so he decided to rebel. Qianlong felt personally betrayed by this disloyalty, so he decided to wipe the Dzungars from the face of the earth. This was a pretty standard ethnic cleansing. Anyone who didn't get out of the way was killed, anyone who did get out of the way starved. Muslim Chinese, the Hui, had become rather common in the northwest, along the trading routes to the Middle East. During the Taiping Rebellion, which is much later on the list, Qing officials had formed local militias all over the country to defend small communities from Taiping raiding. But in the western province of Shaanxi, the Hui formed militias to protect themselves from their Han neighbors, with whom they had an ongoing feud. Some Hui soldiers on their way home from fighting the Taipings got to arguing over the price of bamboo poles in the marketplace in Huanzhou. Fighting broke out and several Hui were killed. That night, the local Han set the Hui quarter on fire, and from there, it became a full-fledged civil war. As the war ravaged the countryside, supplies of food, fuel, and fodder ran out, and the prices rose beyond the reach of most inhabitants. Famine followed. Hui militias brought the cities of Tongzhou and Xi'an under siege, but the Qing troops inside held out. Within a few months, Qing armies forced the rebels to retreat westward into the Gansu Corridor, which is a narrow strip of fertile land tucked between the western mountains and the deserts that traditionally had connected China with the Silk Road to the Middle East. Here, the war stalemated. In 1868, a Chinese commander, Zhuao Zongtang, arrived in Xi'an. Zhuao had come to prominence by his influential involvement in putting down the Taiping Rebellion. He was a meticulous organizer and took his time training, supplying, and planning his offensive. Finally, he fought his way outward town by town along the Gansu Corridor, eventually homing in on one specific Hui leader, Ma Hualong, as the most important man he needed to destroy. Ma Hualong was besieged in the Hui capital at Jinjibao for 16 long, hungry months. After the Hui rebels surrendered in March 1871, Ma Hualong, his family, and over 80 of his officials put to death by the technique of the death of 1,000 cuts, which is probably one of the worst ways to die. The last major Hui city, Suzhou, fell in November of 1873, followed by a general massacre of the population. But the war continued in the countryside for several more years. Many tens of thousands of survivors fled west, into lands under Russian control. All of this over some bamboo poles. In 1991, as the American-led coalition drove Saddam out of Kuwait, the Americans encouraged the Iraqis to overthrow the dictator who had dragged them into a war against the entire world. The Shiite Arabs of the southern marshes rose in revolt, expecting the coalition to come to their aid. The Americans were not about to get sucked into a civil war, so they held back while Saddam moved in and massacred 50,000 Shiite rebels. A simultaneous uprising of Kurds also failed to dislodge him, and Saddam chased the Kurds into the mountains of the north, where American air cover eventually helped them establish an autonomous zone. Although the world quarantined Saddam in Iraq after 1990, see sanctions against Iraq, which is atrocity number 99 on the list, for disrupting international peace, that never seemed like a satisfactory solution. Leaving such a valuable supply of the world's oil sitting unused under a pariah dictator was dangerous and unprofitable. So in March of 2003, hoping to drag Iraq kicking and screaming back into the global economy, American President George Bush and Prime Minister Tony Blair invaded Iraq on now what we know to be totally bogus claims that they were developing weapons of mass destruction. An invasion force of around 160,000 troops were sent in and clumsily replaced Saddam with what was now supposed to be a post of Western civilization to spread democracy and feminism. But it deteriorated into car bombs and chaos instead. It's pretty hard to establish a democracy in a place that doesn't want it. But Saddam, now a prisoner, was tried and hung by this new regime in 2006. As brutal as Saddam Hussein was, he was at the very least able to stabilize Iraq. With Saddam swinging at the gallows, there was a massive power vacuum that needed to be filled. The United States tried to fill it, but that didn't go well. Again, trying to force a country that was ruled by Muslim strongmen with highly centralized authority for much of its life didn't have much luck in installing a democracy. Since America was delusional in its attempts to govern Iraq, it failed to keep order, which led to widespread looting and violence. Iraqi citizens' views of America and to the West in general soured, and the Americans officially withdrew in 2011. Although the Iraq War was finished in 2011, Iraq never really recovered, and has had one conflict after another. After America left, the battle was mainly against the new Iraqi government America tried to establish versus terrorist groups and people who were still loyal to the Ba'ath Party, using mainly guerrilla warfare tactics. So business as usual took place. Car bombings, suicide bombings, mass murders. But in 2014, ISIS launched a northern Iraq offensive from Syria. The Syrian Civil War started to leak into Iraq, and they declared a worldwide Islamic caliphate. This changed America's mind about sitting on the sidelines, so Barack Obama decided to deploy more troops. Since then, American intervention started to slowly wean away, and in 2021, Joe Biden officially ended the fight against the Islamic State. And the forces that remain in Iraq have taken up advising and training roles, rather than fighting roles. Aside from the horrible political instability, nothing major has happened since. The debate over slavery in the United States became so intense that the old political alliances shattered. Both political parties split into northern and southern wings, and 4 presidential candidates ran in the 1860 election. When Abraham Lincoln of the anti-slavery Republican Party was elected, the slave states of the South were pissing and shitting and coming. As the rebellious states were setting up their independent confederacy, they seized federal property all across the South, climaxing with the April 1861 attack on Fort Sumter and Charleston Harbor, which officially opened the American Civil War. Recruitment and training took a while, but by spring of 1862, the two sides had big new armies manned, equipped, and ready. A glacial advance brought the Union Army from Washington to within a few miles of the rebel capital of Richmond, Virginia, when the new Confederate general, Robert E. Lee, attacked and drove them back in the 7 Days Battle, in a rolling firefight across several counties east of Richmond. Suddenly, the war picked up speed. For the next year, the land between the two rival capitals saw a bloody seesaw of offensives, without either side gaining an advantage. A new federal attack southward was stopped at Manassas, followed by a rebel attack northward that was stopped at Antietam. Then 2 federal thrusts were stopped at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, followed by a rebel attack that was stopped at Gettysburg. Tens of thousands of dead soldiers littered the battlefields around Virginia. But west of the Appalachian Mountains, however, the war progressed solidly southward, with each confrontation resolving in favor of the Union. In the same years that the Eastern War had rolled back and forth, the Union in the West under Ulysses S. Grant had captured 2 entrenched rebel armies at Fort Donelson and Vicksburg, stood off a determined counteroffensive at Shiloh, scattered a Third Army in panic at Chattanooga, and consolidated control over the Mississippi River and several key railroads. In 1864, Grant took command of the troops in the East to break Lee's army, and the conflict quickly became a war of attrition. Throughout May and June, the rebel army in Virginia was ground down and pushed back into siege lines at the railroad junction of Petersburg, while the last major Confederate army in the West was battered and cornered in Atlanta. After several months of sniping, bombardment, direct assaults, and flanking, these rebel armies were pried loose from their trenches and destroyed. After the war, the South was pretty much destroyed, and the Union Army occupied them for around 4 years. And the Republican Party had a supermajority in the federal government, so they pretty much passed what they wanted. They made slavery illegal, obviously, but they made an even greater change with the 14th and 15th Amendments, which granted full citizenship and equal protection under the law to former slaves and every other American citizen. The entire political structure of the country was rebuilt by these amendments, and the United States became less of a nationalistic country and more of an ideological one. Iran and Iraq had disputed ownership of the oil-rich borderlands along the Shatt al-Arab River at the head of the Persian Gulf for years. Then, Saddam Hussein tried to take advantage of the chaos unleashed by the 1979 Iranian Revolution by annexing the disputed territory. Iraqi armies crossed into Iran in September of 1980 and rammed through the first Iranian lines of defense. But as Iranian resistance stiffened, the war stalled. When 2 of the world's biggest oil suppliers go to war, the rest of the world has to take sides. But when the war is between a brutal dictatorship and a fanatic theocracy, it's hard to know which side to take. But as a purely practical matter, it's easier to line up with corrupt dictators because they're usually more willing to work a deal. So most of the world sided with Iraq. Centrist Muslim states such as Egypt, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia openly assisted the Iraqis, as did the Soviets, who were the traditional Cold War sponsors of Iraq. The United States supplied the Iraqis with intelligence and committed the US Navy to safeguarding the flow of oil out of Iraq and the flow of money and weapons into Iraq. The Islamic Republic of Iran was too crazy for any respectable nation to support openly, but plenty of nations operated covertly. The world's outcast states, Israel, South Africa, North Korea, and Libya, for example, supported their fellow outcast by supplying military technology and expertise in exchange for cash or oil. Iran also got secret aid from the superpowers in exchange for the Iranians using their influence with dangerous Muslim fanatics. Iran influenced Afghanistan, which was initiated by the Russians, and Lebanon, which was aided by the Americans. In May of 1982, an Iranian counterattack restored the border and shifted the momentum of the conflict. Over the next couple of years, the Iranians gradually slugged deeper into Iraq until the war stalled in the suburbs of the Iraqi city of Basra. By now, both sides had become desperate and were fighting dirtier than usual. To terrorize the enemy population, both sides sent warplanes and missiles screaming out of the sky into cities far behind the front lines. Iraq shelled enemy soldiers with nerve gas. Iranians took advantage of their superior numbers to launch human waves against the Iraqi positions in hopes that some might break through. Iran launched Operation Khyber from mid-February to mid-March of 1984 over control of the strategic Basra-Baghdad waterway. It was an ugly slugging match of Iranian frontal assaults and Iraqi gas attacks that killed 20,000 Iranians and 6,000 Iraqis and mutilated and scarred tens of thousands more. The last major offensive was the Battle of Basra, which became the bloodiest battle fought anywhere in the world since World War II. From December 1986 to April 1987, approximately 50,000 Iranians and 8,000 to 15,000 Iraqis were slaughtered for no gain on either side. None of these efforts broke the stalemate. They merely elevated this conflict to the deadliest war for soldiers since Vietnam. Finally, in August of 1988, when it became clear that no one was going to win, the two exhausted countries agreed to a ceasefire. Sometimes, a nation just fizzles out. Spain had a good run, but centuries of Habsburg inbreeding had finally produced a king barely able to function as an adult. King Charles II of Spain, the sole surviving son of a marriage between an uncle and a niece. Charles was dysfunctional on almost every level. He was unable to speak until he was 4, and unable to walk until 8. Because of a massive deformed jaw, he was barely able to speak coherently or chew, and since he had some issues with his peen, he produced no children. Charles's arch nemesis was also his brother-in-law. King Louis XIV of France had married Charles's half-sister, the oldest daughter of the previous king of Spain. As the Sun King, Louis set Europe's standards of magnificence with his new palace at Versailles. By the year 1700, he had already fought 4 wars against the rest of Europe, trying to take several Spanish territories. To keep France from gaining too much power, Austria, Britain, and Holland had established the ongoing Grand Alliance. Everyone expected Charles to have a short life. Most people expected him to die in childhood, but he lasted a lot longer than anyone thought possible. But the extinction of the Spanish Habsburgs was just a matter of time, so the rest of Europe haggled at several conferences over who should get the inheritance. Several claimants and partition schemes were floated, but it was finally decided to reboot the Habsburgs in Spain using another Charles, the brother of the Emperor Joseph of Austria, while France was kept at bay by giving them stray Habsburgs lands scattered across the continent. Charles got annoyed at the way the other great powers talked about him, like he was already dead, carving up the Spanish Empire without even consulting him. Out of pure spite, in the year 1700, on his deathbed, the mad bastard altered his will to prevent the partition of his vast empire. He gave the whole thing to the French. This would link the two primary powers in Europe, leaving everyone else a distant second. So, the rest of Europe decided they had to stop this union. Louis XIV quickly moved into Spanish territory to stake his claim, and the Grand Alliance came in to stop him. Austrian forces under Prince Eugene of Savoy, a veteran commander of the Great Turkish War, which is Atrocity number 90, invaded Italy to take the Spanish territories of Milan and Naples. The English general, John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, fought the French to a standstill in the Low Countries. The war came to a climax in 1704, when Marlborough marched to the Danube and joined with Eugene to take on the French army that was rampaging in Germany. Although both armies were roughly equal in size, at 50-some thousand, the Franco-Bavarian army had a strong position with their right wing anchored on the Danube. Their infantry was solidly embedded in 3 villages, each about a mile apart, with lines of cavalry stationed between these 3 strong points. With a stealthy night march, the Anglo-Austrians got within striking distance undetected, so when morning came, the French had to scramble into formation. Allied skirmishers and artillery bombardments against the villages tied down the French infantry, while Marlborough drove the bulk of his forces against the cavalry in the center. After the French cavalry was driven off, the infantry was left isolated and surrounded. English musketry and bombardment then destroyed these pockets. By the time it was over, the French and Bavarians lost 80% of their army to death, injury, or captivity, while the Grand Alliance had lost a mere 20%. This was the first major defeat of the French army in over 50 years. The Battle of Blenheim ended all combat on the Danube and removed the direct threat against Austria. However, the tide of war accidentally turned back to France's favor in 1711, when Emperor Joseph I of Austria died without having produced any children who lived past childhood. So his brother suddenly became the new emperor, Charles VI of Austria, who had an earlier position as the Austrian claimant to the Spanish throne. England and Holland started panicking. An outright union of Spain and Austria was almost as bad as a union of Spain and France, so they worked out a deal with the French. The final treaty signed at Utrecht split the inheritance. All of the Spanish territories in Europe, bar Spain itself, went to the Austrian Habsburgs. Spain and the overseas colonies went to the side branch of the French Bourbons, which was to remain separate from the French throne. When Hui Rebellion, the chief minister of Dat Viet, which is just medieval Vietnam, usurped the throne in 1400, he smoothed it over diplomatically with his neighbors, especially China, by swearing that no heir remained from the previous Tran dynasty. Then, an outcast Tran prince ruined everything by showing up in China to ask the Ming for help in restoring his family to the throne. The Chinese mobilized 800,000 troops in their southern provinces during the summer of 1406 and invaded Vietnam. In previous invasions southward, Chinese troops experienced difficulty defeating the war elephants of Southeast Asian armies, but now they had horses disguised as lions and primitive guns shooting fire arrows to drive them back. The Chinese invaders overran most of the country, and in the middle of 1407, they captured and executed the current king of Vietnam, Ho Quy Lee's son. They put their man on the throne, which restored the Tran dynasty. But then, the Chinese just wouldn't go home. They began to establish new administrative districts with tax offices, salt offices, which existed to enforce the monopoly, Confucian schools, and Buddhist registries. When the king of Vietnam insisted that it was really time for the Chinese to leave, war erupted. It was a confusing rebellion, with a new leader of the Tran dynasty popping up every time the Chinese killed the old one. But in the year 1413, the last of these, Tran Di Hui Kohang, was beaten in a battle and captured, later committing suicide. The Chinese took control of Vietnam and set out to eradicate the native culture. Chinese dress and customs were imposed on the people. Women were compelled to wear short pants and vests. People had to wear long hair. Public instructions were taught in Chinese, while Vietnamese books were suppressed. The people were brutally overworked to extract the country's resources. An aristocratic landowner, Li Loi, rose in rebellion, but his forces were quickly scattered by the Ming in 1418. Loi regrouped and rebuilt his army deep in the mountains. They hid in remote areas of the country, moving out occasionally to ambush Chinese forces for supplies. If that didn't work, they ate their horses or scrounged wild rice and grass. Over the next 10 years, Li Loi wore down the Chinese by attacking isolated garrisons and supply convoys, and then retreating into the mountains when larger forces arrived. By paying off corruptible officials, Li Loi gained additional supplies and breathing space. Finally, the Chinese gave up and abandoned the country to Li Loi, who established the Li dynasty in 1428. If Li Loi lost, Vietnam today would probably just be another province of China.